I've asked evolutionists all over the country, if evolution is true, I have a simple question. How do we tell right from wrong? How does anybody tell right from wrong if evolution is true? A simple fact is you can't tell right from wrong. There's no such thing as right or wrong if evolution is true. Might makes right. Whoever's the strongest, they get their way. The biggest lion gets the zebra. And that's kind of the way evolution theory ends up. The bottom line is there's no standard for right and wrong, no moral base whatsoever. And I think the theory is not only dumb, I think it's very dangerous.
Shortly after Darwin's theory was published, a man named Christopher Columbus Langdell became dean of Harvard Law School. Langdell believed wholeheartedly in Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. He also believed that as man evolved, his laws must also evolve. Langdell introduced the now famous case law method into the American legal system. In his book on the history of American education, author and researcher Von Schatzer writes that case law basically means judges would interpret the U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights as they believed it should be interpreted, not necessarily in accordance with the intent of the Founding Fathers. In case law, should the judge or judges not believe in God or the Bible, Christian principles or values would not be used. If judges did not believe abortion was murder, they ruled accordingly. If judges did not believe homosexuality was wrong, they ruled accordingly. Sir William Blackstone's famous commentaries on the law were used for about 160 years by American lawyers, courts, U.S. Senate, and law schools to settle disputes, to define words, and to examine procedure. Thomas Jefferson once stated that the influence of Blackstone's commentaries on law was so strong on American lawyers they were used with the same dedication and reverence that Muslims use the Quran. But in the 1930s, Blackstone's commentaries that were based on biblical principles were discarded in favor of the evolutionary case law method. The first major decision the courts made using the case law method was in 1962, the removal of prayer from schools. The Supreme Court reached decisions in 1962 and 1963 that declared prayer and the reading of Bible verses in public schools to be unconstitutional. This is ironic when one considers that the American school system was originally established for the purpose of teaching the Bible to all Americans. Perhaps the chief reason every American child learns to read can be traced to an early American law known as the Old Deluder-Satan Act, established in 1647. The law began with the words, "It being one chief object of that old deluder, Satan, to keep men from the knowledge of the Scriptures as in former times. For this reason, the law stated that children must learn to read and write so they would be able to read the Bible for themselves and avoid the errors of the Dark Ages." Many researchers today consider it of great significance that the 1960s brought an end to an American standard in education that stood for more than 300 years.
In the early 60s, in 63, prayer was taken out of our schools. And right then, from 1963 on, is when we saw a great rise in sexually transmitted diseases, illegal drug use, child abuse, premarital sex. Just all kinds of moral indicators began to fall. America particularly began to fall apart in the early 1960s morally. I think largely because of the introduction of this evolution theory into our textbooks, which says there's no God, there's no way to determine right from wrong.
While biblical teachings on the creation have been removed from schools, the pagan doctrine of evolution has deceptively replaced them. Evolution is perhaps most clearly seen in the Hindu teaching of reincarnation.
Dying and living, this endless cycle of reincarnation. This is the basis of Hindu Eastern mystical thinking, evolution, that there was death that came into the world. Now God says that He created a perfect world. A perfect world, there was no death.
According to the Bible, death entered the world through Adam when he sinned with Eve in the garden. Prior to Adam's sin, there was no death.
Sin brought in death, and God killed the first possibly lamb. The animal sacrifice, the first animal sacrifice, was committed by God himself, who covered the sinners with a covering for sin. And this was a foreshadowing of what he would do through Jesus Christ, that there would be a death and a blood sacrifice to cover sin. So to say that there was death before life and this endless cycle of reincarnation and evolution, which is synonymous, that the two of them go together, is unbiblical. So here we have in schools today, for instance, a faith that undergirds paganism, heathenism, mystical Eastern thinking, which is evolution, which is now being taught in schools as part of a conditioning process, whereas creationism has been taken out of schools because they say it's religious because it comes from the Bible. So you've got one faith, the faith on how the world began, creationism, taken out of the classroom because it's not scientific, but you've got another faith that undergirds Eastern mysticism, evolution, being brought into the classroom called a science.
But why did evolutionary theory gain such strength and power in a nation founded on biblical principles? And how did so many come to believe that evolution is fact rather than theory? The mainstream offers the following view, which seems typical.
Before the 19th century, Western man looked to the Bible for an explanation of his origins. In the story of Genesis, God created man from the dust of the earth 6,000 years ago. But when man dug into the earth for answers, he found evidence that appeared to tell a different story. Evolution.
But is this really what happened? Did the physical evidence give man reason to doubt the biblical account? Or did man create a theory and then go looking for some way to prove it? Modern sources, like this documentary hosted by Charlton Heston, have begun to admit that this was indeed the case.
When Darwin's theory of evolution was embraced, it was assumed that in the next century enough fossil evidence would be found to prove that man had evolved from the apes.
Darwinists have promised us a missing link, and so they've got to deliver. They've got to come up with one. Any missing link will do, it seems. Any missing link will do, it seems.
Darwin published his theory in 1859. It was half a century later before any evidence arrived to support it. In 1912, British scientist Charles Dawson made the Piltdown Man discovery and changed the world. Piltdown Man was considered the missing link, supposedly the skull and jawbone of a half-man, half-ape mutation. It convinced millions that Darwin's theory was scientifically proved. But in 1953, some 40 years later, Piltdown was declared a hoax.
It was somebody taking a human skull and an ape's jawbone. They broke off the joint where they would fit together so they couldn't tell, then filed them down, made them look really old, and buried them in a gravel pit. It was a hoax, a deliberate, either a joke, which they never told anybody about for 40 years, or a lie to try to prove the evolution theory.
In either case, it may be said that no other discovery in the 20th century has had as great an impact on furthering evolution than Piltdown. Stephen Jay Gould writes that Piltdown absorbed the professional attention of many fine scientists. It led millions of people astray for 40 years. Researcher Richard Harder reports that more than 500 articles and memoirs were written on the Piltdown finds before the hoax was exposed. Likewise, articles in encyclopedias and sections in textbooks and popular books of science, an immense amount of derivative work. For many years, the Piltdown finds were a significant percentage of the fossils which were used to reconstruct human ancestry. In his book, The Piltdown Forgery, J.S. Weiner remarks that this ill-begotten form of primitive man received nearly as much attention as all the legitimate specimens in the fossil record put together. Yet once the hoax was exposed, the scientific community failed to repent of its error. The damage had already been done, and a generation of evolutionary thought had been born. Dawson himself never lived to be exposed. He died shortly after his famous discovery in 1916.